Of course, yes. We can't wait to hear that.
So we've got 4 more minutes until 4 p.m. here.
Yep.
Is everyone here, or are we still waiting for people to arrive?
Not really. I think everyone is almost here. Yeah, we could start.
Yeah, we can start where.
I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can start there.
Okay.
So would you like me to start?
Okay, that's great.
All right, I'm going to share my screen.
So is it okay if we have like opening first? Is it okay?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah. Yeah, so we just have a few minutes for the opening session.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I will wait for that.
Yeah, okay. Nova, I think you could start.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Arlena and Sue for the chance. I'm Valenda Pitaloka would be the master of ceremony of the opening session on the general lecture today. Okay. All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable the Committee Chair of General Lecture, Arlena SPD MPD MED. The Honorable the Head of Language Education Department, Didi Suhandi SPD MHUM. The Honorable the Coordinator of English Education Study Program, Harrison Putrajaya SPD MPD. The Honorable Lecturers of English Education and Lecturers of Indonesian and Literature Education Study Program, our beloved students of English Education and students of Indonesian and Literature Education Study Program, and all participants from other universities. We would like to say welcome to you all to today's general lecture on the 15th of April, 2021 at 1 p.m. here, all right, 1:28 p.m. with a topic, an inquiry approach to language or literacy with Sue Nichols, PhD from School of Education, University of South Australia. All right, the first agenda is opening. So let us all say Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Next, welcoming remarks from the chair of the committee by Ibu Arlena SPD MPD MED to Ibu Arlena, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Nova. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, the Honorable Dean of Faculty of Teacher Training and Education, as represented by the Head of Language and Arts Education Department, Dr. Didi Suhendi, the Honorable the Head of English and Education Study Program, Bapak Harisman Putrajaya MPD, our distinguished guest, Dr. Sue Nichols from University of South Australia, my beloved college from English Education Study Program, my students from English Education Study Programs, the committee member, and all of the participants. In this opportunity, I would like to say thank you very much for coming to these sessions, especially for Dr. Sue Nichols, for your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise. We've been waiting for you to meet us for these great sessions. I think it's been quite a long time from 2018. We had a chance to invite you to the conference, but you were on holiday at the time, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, so we are very happy today, yeah. So thank you very much for the Dean for facilitating this event, and also thank you very much for Pak Harisman, the Head of Education Study for English Education Study Program, for initiating this program, and all the college students and all the participants for coming to this event. So this event is intended to expand our knowledge and expertise within the area of language teaching and learning, as well as to build our collaboration and partnerships with other international institutions, so especially with institutions from some Australian universities. So thank you very much for Dr. Sue Nichols and also for the Dean of School of Education of University of South Australia for giving us the chance to meet you for this event. So hopefully this event will be the new beginning of our new journey for our to build our collaboration in the future, within the area of education and also research. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Su, for coming today. And then for the students, please enjoy the sessions and please ask a lot of questions to Dr. Su, so that I think this will be a great opportunity for everyone to share. All right, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much. Back to Nova. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Rena, for your welcoming remarks. The next is welcoming remarks from the Dean of Teacher Training and Education Faculty, Universitas Sriwijaya, to officially open the general lecture. In this occasion, represented by the Head of Language Education Department, Dr. Didi Suhendi, SPD M.Hum. To Bapak Didi, please.
Ya, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke, alhamdulillah pada hari ini kita bisa bertemu. Selamat menjalankan ibadah puasa bagi yang menjalankan. Yang terhormat Ibu WD 3, Ibu Nyimas yang sempat bergabung, kemudian pada sekretaris jurusan, Oprodi, dan narasumber. Ya, Ibu Suni Halls, PhD, terima kasih banyak, thank you very much atas kehadirannya dan kepada mahasiswa yang berbahagia. Alhamdulillah hari ini kita bisa menyelenggarakan kesesuaian. Mudah-mudahan ini menjadi bekal yang sangat berguna bagi para mahasiswa, khususnya mahasiswa program studi pendidikan bahasa Inggris. Terima kasih, thank you very much to Mrs. Sue Nichols, PhD, for joining in this meeting. Thank you very much. Dan sekali lagi saya mewakili dekan yang pada hari ini tidak bisa hadir karena ada acara yang bersamaan, yaitu juga tentang KPK ya, undangan KPK. Untuk itu dengan mengucapkan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, mata kuliah umum program studi pendidikan bahasa Inggris tahun 2021 kami buka dengan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. All right, thank you very much to Bapak Didi for your welcoming remarks to officially open the general lecture today. And then here we are on our main agenda, the general lecture, which will be led by Ibu Lingga Agustina SPD MPD as the moderator. To Ibu Lingga, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Nova. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lingga. It's such an honor for me to be the moderator in this event, in which we have Dr. Sue Nichols with us now. Hello, Dr. Nichols. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nichols to all the audiences here. Dr. Sue Nichols is currently an associate professor in School of Education at University of South Australia. She started her career in education field as a teacher in South Australian Education Department in 1986. I believe most of the audiences here were not even born yet. Yeah. Yeah, so Dr. Nichols involved in many research projects related to language and literacy. We can find her academic insights from many of her publications, books, chapters, and numerous journal articles. Therefore, it is really such an amazing experience we are about to have now, because Dr. Nichols is here with us now, and there will be question and answer sessions later, and audiences are welcome to type their questions in the chat box, or maybe you can ask directly if we have time, yeah, after Dr. Nichols finishes her presentations. So let's welcome Dr. Sue Nichols for our general lectures on an inquiry approach to language and literacy. Dr. Nichols, the Zoom floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very grateful, and what a warm welcome. I'm so appreciative of this opportunity to speak to students and educators and colleagues at SRIWIJAYA University Faculty of Teacher Training and Education. The work that a Faculty of Teacher Training and Education has to do is very important. Helping to prepare people to become educators is a very strong responsibility that we take very seriously as teacher educators. And it's something that gives me great rewards to know that I am part of that process. I see many of my students who have undertaken their teacher training, go out into practice and become very effective teachers who get a lot of joy out of their work. And then sometimes I get to see them come back to the university as postgraduate students so that they can develop their knowledge further. And in my talk today, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the insights that I have gained from working in teacher education with a focus on language and literacy. And that includes insights that I have gained from the educators that I work with, who do research with me, who undertake their further studies with me, and who are investigating and inquiring in their own classrooms to try to improve the learning experience for their students and to improve their professional practice as educators. And through this process, I always strive to improve my own professional practice as a teacher educator. So I'm now going to share my screen with you, and I do have a PowerPoint presentation which I will put up, and hopefully you should be able to see that now. So I'll begin by just outlining what I hope to cover in today's lecture. There are 4 points that I would like to spend some time on. We'll begin by looking at a functional view of language in social context. This is a framework that is used in our teacher education programs in language and literacy, and it connects with the Australian curriculum, which has got this functional view of language integrated into the English curriculum. We're going to spend a little time looking at explicitness, and that should say, and elaboration, explicitness and elaboration in spoken language. Then we're going to have a look at genres in writing and speech. And then the fourth part of the lecture will look at an inquiry approach for language teachers. So first of all, about a functional view of language. Now, I'm sure that some of these ideas are already quite familiar to you, but if they are, you might be interested to know that these are some basic ideas that are part of the teacher training in English in the South Australian context. So we begin by thinking about language as a system of resources that is used to make meanings in order to achieve social goals. Language is organised according to its function. So depending on what we want to do with the language will be organised in certain ways. Within language, we have grammar. And grammar, we can understand as a system of patterns and structures used to organize words into meaningful sentences. So grammar helps our language to accomplish the functions that we need it to do for us. Both written and spoken language have grammar. So in the talk today, you'll hear me make reference to spoken language quite often. So this view of language, which I'm presenting to you, integrates both writing and speech within the same framework. And there are different varieties of language that we can choose according to the context. So depending where we are, who we are speaking to, you know, what we want to be achieving in that situation, we will select a variety of language that is suitable. And when we're working with children, what we want them to learn is for them to have an understanding of the way that they can select their language from the different alternatives that are available to them. So this diagram, which you'll be seeing a few times in this lecture, summarizes this view of language. So in the blue square, we have the communication context, which is the situation in which we're using our language. An important part of that is the purpose for the language and the audience or the participants, the people that are interacting in that context. And then within that communication context, we have our language, which is our resource for communication. Now, we also have other resources for communication because we have nonverbal communication as well. But here in this lecture, I'm going to be mainly focusing in on written and spoken language. So another way of thinking about context in relation to language is looking at, we have the smallest unit, perhaps not the smallest unit, we could be thinking about letters as well, but we're talking about units of meaning. So our smallest unit of meaning is a word. Now, the sentence provides the context for the word. Without that context, we can't be very sure what that word is intended to mean. If we have a look up words in a dictionary, we will find that many words have got multiple meanings, and we need to see them in their context. And then if we go up to a broader view of context, we have the text. So the text provides the context for the sentence. If you think, for instance, of a text such as a newspaper article, a sentence within that is provided with its meaning in the context of the overall article. And then at the broadest level of context, we have the social context. So I might be reading this newspaper article. We talk about paper. Of course, these days, mostly we're reading off a screen. But I might be reading it with some friends around me, and I might be sharing with them some of the news of the day. And that provides a social context for that particular text. And in another occasion, I might be with different people, and the way that I select from that particular text, the examples I want to share with them might be different. So at every level of language, we've got context providing the scaffold for the meaning making. Another way of thinking about a context is purpose. Now, I've talked about purpose of the language and how that can impact on the type of language that we are using. You may be familiar or not with this particular framework here. We use a textbook called Teaching Language in Context, which is written by Bev Derawianka and Pauline Jones. And Bev Derawianka has been a very influential person in Australia. She helped to write the national curriculum, and in particular, she wrote the language strand of the national curriculum. So we have 3 strands in our national English curriculum, which is language, literacy, and literature. I saw somebody had their hand up. Now, I'm going to ask if you would like to put your questions into the chat box, and I will keep an eye on that. And then if I am able to answer that question whilst I'm delivering the lecture, I will do so. Otherwise, I will answer it when I've got through all of the content. So anyway, if we have a look at this particular diagram here, it's once again, the social purpose or the social context is the widest frame. And then inside that, we have what is called the language system. Now, this particular framework for understanding the language system looks at the purposes of language as being in 3 categories. I'm not going to use these exact words that are in the diagram. I'm going to give you, I guess, a bit more of an accessible version. So one of our purposes for language is getting our ideas across. I have an idea in my mind. I want you to understand my idea. So I need to use language for that purpose. And then second, getting on with others. That means having good, effective relationships with other people. So for instance, in a language situation, I don't want to offend somebody by saying something that they might be upset by. If I'm a nice person, I guess if I'm not a very nice person, I might not care and just say whatever I wish. But most people would prefer to get on with others. So we need to shape our language in order to help us do that. And the third reason or purpose for language is to conform to our language conventions. Our language has certain rules. It has, certain ways that we need to structure our language. And we want to be able to demonstrate to others that we have an understanding of our language. We want to show that we have been properly trained and educated and we know how to use our language. So in terms of that purpose, that is what motivates us to use language in accordance with those rules and conventions. So those are the purposes. Now on this diagram that you can see there, we've got those 3 purposes. SRIWIJAYA and Jones calls the first purpose expressing ideas. The second one, interacting with others. And the third one is called text structure, which I have explained as conforming to our language conventions. Now, SRIWIJAYA and Jones have created categories to name these different functions, which our students will learn, and they may or may not remember these categories. Some of them do and some of them don't. The category for expressing ideas or getting our ideas across is called the ideational function, if you really want to go into this framework in some depth. The category for interacting with others is called the interpersonal function, and the category for conforming to language conventions is called the textual function. And in functional linguistics, these functions are also referred to as the field, the tenor, and the mode. Now, I'm not going to go deeply into that in this lecture, but I thought I would just, for those of you that are particularly interested and would like to understand this model in more detail, I thought I would just explain it a little bit more. But we're going to move on to thinking about what this means for children. So we've been really emphasising the importance of context and in terms of the language situation in which we are communicating, in which we're using our language. Now, of course, young children are still learning a lot about the world. They're learning about relationships, they're learning about rules and conventions, they're learning about all kinds of information, and they're also learning about their language. In some of my research, I'm quite often working with children, and I'm quite often gathering their language through recording children when they speak, either when I ask them to speak to me or when they are just involved in a play situation or in a classroom situation. So what I've observed about children is that they often encounter new words for the first time while participating in a social activity. I wonder how many of you are parents. Have you observed this with your own children? They're learning their words and they're interested in doing something. It might be playing. Maybe they're just listening to the grown-ups talking. They might be watching something on YouTube. They might be singing along to some music. Perhaps they're at the market with you doing some shopping, or in the kitchen while the cooking is happening, or they're at a community event. In those places, we're not having lessons for children where we're teaching them words, but they're learning them anyway. And they're learning them in context. They're learning them through participating in these types of events. What this means is that the understanding children have of their words, the understanding they have of language, is influenced by the experiences that they're having when they are encountering that language for the first time. Now, in one of my projects, I asked children to define words for me. And those were not everyday words. They weren't simple words like table or chair. They were words that might not be so familiar to children, words that you might find in, say, a book, a piece of literature. One of these words was swirling. Swirling. I don't know if you're familiar with this English word. I'm not going to give you a dictionary definition, but what I will do is I will show you the children's definitions. Here's how one child defined swirling: spinning around. Another one said this: swirling is like this, like a snake, it swirls around, and they showed with their hand the gesture of a snake. Another one said, make it don't go down in your mouth. Sometimes they do that with wine. They go, This child has obviously seen grown-ups tasting wine. And another child went, oh, like a swirl storm, you're swirling in the water. So she's imagining herself in the water, creating like a whirlpool through her spinning. And then another one said, sometimes my cat swirls, and then kind of pretended to be a cat and spun around. Now, I wonder how as educators you respond when you see these examples. It would be really interesting for you to spend a little time just thinking about that. Thinking about what is it telling you about language and what is it telling you about children? Should we be worried as teachers that no child is giving a dictionary definition of this word? Is it a problem that children are having different experiences and getting different understandings of words? I wonder whether anybody would like to have something to say about that. I'm going to share that with you. I'm hoping that some of the questions that I'm asking you in this lecture are things that you can go away and think about and talk about with each other later on. Now, all of us have been children, us have developed our language, but the thing is, it doesn't stop. I'm constantly learning new words and new expressions all the time. And as the world changes, we have to name the new things that are happening. When, as educators, we reflect on our own language learning and growth, this can help us have insight into our students' experiences. One of the things that I try to emphasize when working with people who are training to be teachers is the importance of empathy. That is, of actually being able to put yourself in the place of the learner. So here's some questions for you about your own language development. This might be something that you reflect on later on after this lecture. Can you remember encountering a strange new word? How did you try and figure out its meaning? What strategies did you use? If you saw the word in a written text, how did you try and work out how to pronounce it? When I was a child, I really enjoyed reading, but that meant that I was reading lots of words that I'd never heard anybody actually use in my day-to-day life. And I could only figure out what they meant by trying to work it out from the storyline. And I had no idea what these words were meant to sound like. My inner voice would give some pronunciation of these words. But later on, as an adult, I discovered that I had actually learned the pronunciation of these words, many of these words, quite incorrectly. So I'll just go back to my diagram and just let's remind ourselves of what we're talking about here. We're talking about how the language that we use, and whether that's written or spoken, is always within a communication context. And as part of that communication context, there are purposes for the language. There are things that we want to be doing with it. So I'm going to give you a language situation now. I'm going to show you a little cartoon. And I want you to look at what's happening in this cartoon and ask yourself this question. How does the communication context influence the language use of the participants? Now, you might not see this, so I'll read it to you. This is a little cartoon strip, and the characters are a teenage boy, that's the one with the yellow hair, and his mum and dad. And we see his mother here. So he's come in, he's dumped his school bag on the table. You can see that there, dumped it. His mum's just been drying the dishes or something. And she says, "How was your day, Jeremy?" "Okay." "Tell me about school, every detail." He's in the fridge now looking for food. "Well, it's a big building." "Every other detail," she says. All right. So that's an interaction between a parent and a teenage boy. I don't know whether those kind of interactions ever happen in your households. I'm a parent and I can remember my teenage girls would sometimes behave like this. I would be very, very keen to know what was going on at school, and they would be much less keen to tell me at the end of the day. And they would certainly be very, very keen to get into the fridge and find some food. So here's the question. There's the diagram. Here's a language situation. How might we describe what's going on in the communication context, and how is that context influencing the language use of the participants? I'm going to actually give you a little bit of time to think about that. If you happen to have somebody with you, if you're in a room with someone, perhaps you might like to have a little bit of a chat with them. If you want to put some ideas into the chat box in terms of what you think might be going on, I'd be able to have a look at it. Oh, there are some things in the chat box. Excellent. I can see that there's a response to the word swirling. Yes, I can hear someone.
It's actually me. I just trying to say that there is a response in the chat box, Dr. Nichols.
Oh, thank you, Linda.
Sorry.
Yeah, you were right. There is a response.
Yes.
And this is from Sari Silviani, saying that the children's response to the word swirling reflect their experience in the context of their living. And the wine tasting context might not be common to Indonesian children, and I guess it wouldn't be. But Indonesian children might have their own experiences of the idea of swirling, the experience of swirling. And I guess this is the thing about thinking about language in context, is in a multicultural country like Australia, where we have children who in families who have come from all different countries and of origin. They have different cultures at home. and they're going to form their understandings of the meanings of words and language within those cultural contexts as well. So that starts to become part of the rich diversity of the linguistic resources within our classrooms. Well, nobody's wanted to say too much about what's happening in this little cartoon here between the mum and the son, and maybe that's because boys in Indonesia love talking about school. Am I right? Maybe not.
Not really.
Not really. No. You know what? I think some things are universal, and that seems to be one. It doesn't seem to matter where I go in the world. That is what parents are telling me. So, okay, I'll just get back into the chat. No idea, no idea. No idea, Mum. Maybe that's how an Indonesian boy would say it, much more politely. So, I'm now going to move to thinking about explicitness and elaboration. Because although, hang on a minute, I'm just wondering whether I've got this in the right order. Hang on a minute, just bear with me. All right, I have, it's okay. I'll go back. All right, explicitness and elaboration. One of the ways to describe what's happening in this little cartoon that I just showed you is that we've got a boy who does not want to be explicit and he does not want to elaborate. He's using the most minimal type of answer he can possibly give his mum, which is not even a whole word, but just a single letter of the alphabet, which is K. Now, I work with teachers, and teachers in Australia have started to say to me that they're very concerned about children's spoken language. I don't know if you have the same kind of concerns in Indonesia, but teachers are saying things like, kids are spending too much time on their iPads and playing computer games, and they're not talking enough, they don't know how to have a conversation, and so on. So in my work with teachers, I often want to think about what do they actually mean? What is it that they really want to see from these children in terms of their spoken language? And it often comes down to language which is more explicit and elaborated. That is, they want people to use their spoken language fully, to fully describe situations and be able to do that in detail. So Sari has said that she's got an idea for the mum is, tell me one interesting thing which happened in school today, which is asking for that specificity. So yes, you're right, Dr. Magdalena Vianti. The boy was playing a little game with his mum where he's sort of giving her what she asked for, which is every detail, but he gave her a detail that wasn't what he knew would not be relevant. Anyway, when we think about why we would want to be explicit and elaborate, what are the aspects of the context that can help to influence that? It's influenced by the topic, the audience, the situation, and the consequences. So in manipulating those things, we can help to create conditions where there will be more explicitness and more elaboration. We're more likely to speak explicitly and in detail if one or more of these conditions are present. If the topic is complex, if the audience does not share our knowledge, if we want to be understood, if the situation is novel or unpredictable, and if there are negative consequences for leaving out details or being misunderstood. If one or more of those conditions are present, then people will feel more obliged to be explicit and elaborate in their oral language, and this includes children as well. Now, what often happens in classrooms? Teachers ask questions that they already know the answer to, don't they? If any of you are educators, have you done that? I have. I think we all have. There's a type of interaction exchange in classrooms called the IRE. I don't know if you've heard of this. I haven't got a slide on it. I just remembered it. But the IRE stands for Initiation Response Evaluation. The teacher asks a question, the kid responds, and the teacher gives the evaluation. Yes, no, right, wrong, etc. But the problem is that if we already know the answer to that question, and furthermore, if the students know we already know the answer, why do they need to be explicit and elaborate? If we ask questions to which we genuinely do not know the answer or not the full answer, then the people that we're talking to will feel more obliged to be explicit and elaborate. And as educators, we can help to manipulate these conditions by, for instance, creating audiences for children's communications. So, for instance, there's been some research that has backed this up. In one study, the researchers told a story to a group of young children and asked them to retell the story. This is quite a common research technique that is used. And they found these young children just didn't do a particularly good job. They left out a lot of the story. So the next time they said, we'd like you to tell us what happened to you in your holidays or on the weekend. And I'm going to write this down, and then I'm going to make a story out of it to tell to other children, some other children in a different school. So now these children understand that there are some other children who they don't know, who are in a different school, who are going to learn about their experience. And then these young children started to become much more explicit and elaborate. They gave a lot more detail because they understood that those other children would not know lots of things about the context and that they would need to explain those things to them. Quite often we underestimate what children are capable of because we don't create the conditions that they will understand as obliging them to go further, to say more. Okay, let's go on. So if we go back to the cartoon, we see here that different participants can have different purposes in a language interaction. So we had two participants there. We had Jeremy's mother. She wants to know how he's going at school. So she asks him to elaborate. But then we have Jeremy. He doesn't want to talk to her about school. So he chooses an irrelevant detail to tell her. So one of the things about communication situations is we will understand what's happening in the language interaction more if we understand the purposes of the participants in that interaction. Now I'm going to start talking about genre, but I think what I'll do is I'll take a small break and give you an opportunity to ask questions about what I've just been talking about or to make any comments that you would like to make. So in fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now and come back to you as a group and invite your questions or your comments. For instance, I've been making some guesses because I don't know the Indonesian context and you know it very, very well. So I don't know whether the things I'm talking about are things that you would notice yourself as educators or as parents. Who's going to be brave? This happens with my students as well, by the way. They all wait for somebody else to speak. I believe that somebody's going to be brave. This is why I'm going to wait a little bit longer. Okay, so I've got a question that's come up on the chat from Sabrina Nabila. And she says she's a student of English education, and she wants to ask, one of the language social purposes is to express ideas and interact with others. My question is, why is it really hard to speak or say something in English? Sometimes we totally understand what someone is talking about, but it is really hard for us to communicate in English. Like, in my head is full of ideas and stuff like that, but it is hard to say it in English as our second language. Well, in that communication context, there's an additional level of diversity. You haven't explained, Sabrina, if you're talking about situations where you are, as a speaker who's learning English, it's speaking with others who are also learning English, or whether you're speaking to people who are experienced English language users, because I think that will make a difference. But one of the things that we can do as educators, if we have got linguistically diverse classes, which we certainly have in Australia. So in a classroom in Australia, there might be children who come from homes where English is not spoken. And these children might have been in the country for quite a short time, and their English is still at a very early stage of their development. EFL, not ESL, right. So in the language interactions in those diverse situations, it's important that we create the purpose for the language interaction, to create the purpose. That's our job as educators, to create the purpose. Because I think what sometimes happens is people are put into pairs with a partner or something like that, and they have to have a conversation. And the purpose of the conversation is just to practice their English. And in those situations, it's very difficult. I mean, I've been learning Mandarin Chinese, so I am a language learner as well. And I experience the same issues myself when I am using a language that is not my first. I find myself struggling to come up with, the things to say. And partly that's because there hasn't been a purpose created. When I'm traveling and I don't have a translator and something goes wrong, like, I get off the plane and my luggage didn't arrive and there's nobody there who speaks English, I will make the best use of my language that I can, because I really want to be understood. I will use the wrong word and I will add miming, and I will draw pictures, and I will do all kinds of things to make myself understood. So I think that one of the things that it comes down to is authenticity and meaningfulness in the language situation that we create in the classroom, to try to as much as possible, create situations where our students can see that there is a purpose for using their language, that there is, that there are consequences, that there are jobs that we can do with our language, that there are functions that we can carry out with our language, rather than function to practice our language. I'm not sure whether that actually answered you, Sabrina, but I'm very grateful for your question. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I've got a hand raised by Nabila Ricky Ariani. Please ask your question.
Hello, Dr. Nichols. I'm Nabila Ricky Ariani, and I'm in my first semester. I would like to ask a question. As an English learner, to start off with communication context, by using that, should we firstly learn by writing first, or by speaking or spoken first?
Well, neither is wrong. I guess what we would generally advise is to integrate written and spoken communication. But if you remember, we're thinking about the context and the purpose. So in some contexts and for some purposes, we would wish to write. For instance, the person that we are communicating with is not physically present with us, or they're not present online with us. In other contexts, we would wish to speak because, you know, the person is right there. So as an educator, what you want to do is to create different contexts in the learning situation and get your students thinking about how would I choose my communication approach in this particular context. Would I write? Would I speak? Would I use gestures? Would I use visual aids to assist me? So in my lecture, for instance, I'm speaking, but I also have written parts of it, which are on the PowerPoint slide. And also I have used diagrams as well. So I would say that this particular communication is what we would call multimodal. That is, it's actually combining these different resources for communicating. Is that helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Nicole.
You're very welcome. And there's a comment here that personality might affect communication, and I think that's true. I mean, there are people who are very outgoing, as we say, sociable type of people, you know, confident people. And there are people who we would describe as shy, possibly a little bit withdrawn. And as educators, it's part of our job to make sure that we provide the appropriate types of opportunities for people as well that can help to for them to feel comfortable in the language situation. Okay, I think I'll go back to my presentation now, and we'll have who is it who is keeping the time? Is that you, Linga?
Yes.
And Linga, how much more time do I have?
Including the whole discussion, I mean, including the question and answer sessions, you have at least 1 more hour to go.
All right.
3:30.
Okay, no problem. So I'm going to go back into my presentation now, and we'll have another opportunity for some discussion. I'll just wait a little bit because we do have a hand up. That is Fatia.
Yes.
Karunisa.
Yeah.
Fatia, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, yes. Dr. Nichols, hello.
Hello.
My name is Nisa. So my question is, why people could end up with some kind of misunderstanding? What kind of context influenced them?
Right. That's a very interesting question. I think misunderstandings are very common. And I think people who are learning a language worry about being misunderstood. And they tend to assume that those who are very confident and very experienced in the language would not have these misunderstandings. Actually, misunderstandings happen all the time, and they're inherent to language situations, partly because of the different purposes that different participants will bring to a language situation. If my purpose is different from your purpose, and especially if I'm not sure, if I don't know what your purpose is, then I will tend to interpret your language using my purpose. And that quite often is how misunderstandings happen. The other reason that misunderstandings happen is if we don't use checks, if we don't use checkbacks with the participant that we're interacting with. Sometimes people feel that it might be a bit rude to interrupt someone and ask them to repeat themselves or ask them to explain something or to define a word. And so people, and because they haven't done that checking, then the misunderstanding can continue. The third reason misunderstandings can happen, and they do happen a lot, is that people have got different knowledge resources. So what you know and what I know is different. And what I know is the foundation for what I can say to you. So I'll give you, we're going to see an example actually in this lecture in a little while, but children often get frustrated with grown-ups because a child will be trying to communicate something and they're using language that they understand. And this might be from their play or from a game or from something on television. And the adult they're talking to hasn't heard of that thing. They don't know about these characters. And so the adult might not understand the child and the child might get frustrated. So I guess the thing is that a misunderstanding isn't a problem. A misunderstanding is inherent to language situations that involve human beings with different purposes. And what we do in a language situation is we try to negotiate meaning with each other. And the more actively we can attempt to negotiate the meaning, the more likely we are to be able to resolve those misunderstandings. Is that okay?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nichols.
Okay, I better just, I'm asking if it's okay, and please tell me I have not well understood, because I'm happy to a different approach to explaining. Oh, someone called Ida Rosmalina has said Indonesian teens know the term baper or baper, in which a person who has different background and experiences with something mentioned in the communication, this will lead to a very common misunderstanding. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Baper.
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 Baper. Okay.
Baper. It should be baper.
Explain that to me a little bit more. Can somebody explain it to me a bit more?
Ma'am Ida, what do you think? You can directly explain.
Nichols.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, Ida.
Hello. Yeah. Oh, we call it baper. Bawa perasaan it means that when we are talking about something, a person in the conversation feels something which is not exactly what is purposed, what is exactly directed by the person, by the speaker. So he or she feels something different. So that's what we call baper. Expect, you know.
What a useful word. What a very useful word. I wish we had this word in English. I mean, this is the fantastic thing about languages, is that languages reflect, you know, the cultures and you know, the understandings and the meanings that are happening in those particular contexts.
Yeah, you just mentioned it just now. It is related to something in the last part that you mentioned, in that emotion also plays a part in the conversation. So when someone says something which is, for example, that person who is talked to, okay, has something bad experience about it, so he or she will feel baper. So he will feel differently to something from something that the person, the speaker, means.
Absolutely. And it might be something that is completely unintended by the other person in the conversation.
That's right.
It's such an interesting subject, isn't it? Well,
it is.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for helping me to understand that. That's something that I'm going to take away from this conversation. And I can see that Amelia has got her hand up. Would you like to speak, Amelia?
Okay. Hi. So my name is Amelia Caroline Septinis Manungkailit, and I am from English Education Study Program. So I want to ask you, when you asked about how did I encounter the new words, I remember when I knew some words from every source, and turned out not all of them are good words. So some of them are bad words. So, well, I was consider myself as a learner who needs someone to guide me. But somehow, people were misunderstanding me, and some of them thought that I said something inappropriate. And it made me feel a bit down that day. So what do you think about this case, and what kind of approach that we need to do when we try to educate other people? Thank you.
Amelia, it's really interesting that you spoke, because I saw you like this, and when I was talking, and I knew you were remembering something embarrassing, because you were like, and so this is exactly what happens sometimes, that we can sometimes not understand the register. So the register is that part of language which tells us whether the language we're using is formal or informal. And some kinds of informal language are very informal, right? So I'm looking at someone's screen at the moment. Are you Fabiola's screen? I'm not too sure why I'm seeing that. Are you? Perhaps you could stop screen sharing. I think that would be probably a good idea. Anyway, register. So in terms of teaching language in schools, we quite often teach children about register. And so, for instance, I would say when I was an English teacher to my teenage class, and now let's think about a situation where you are making conversation with somebody. Now, this situation is one where a very important person is visiting your family home, and your mum has got all the best, china and the fancy stuff out there, and the nice things to eat, and all these kind of things, right? And you are introduced to this person. Think about how you would speak in that situation, all right? Then I would get them to do some role plays. And teenagers, love to pretend to be very fancy and posh, as we say. So they would put on all of their fancy words. And then I'd say, okay, let's pretend that your friends have come over to watch some movies or something, and you just lying on the couch, you've got your feet up on the coffee table, you're drinking some soft drinks or whatever, and think about the conversation you will have in those circumstances. Now, it's a classroom, so I'll say, please don't use any rude language, let's keep it clean, but then they will role play that situation. So through that, that helps them to understand that we make choices based on our understanding of what's socially appropriate, and what's appropriate when we are in an informal situation with our friends, or, heaven forbid, sort of drinking alcohol or something like that. Anyway, the language is going to be different from when our parents invite the important guest to our house and we have that conversation. So what we want is for children and students to understand they have to make choices, and that they will be judged on the choices that they make. If they make the appropriate choices, they're going to look like a socially competent person. And if they make the inappropriate choices, there could be consequences for them. Now, sometimes people innocently make the wrong choices. So, for instance, I was in a taxi going to the airport, and the taxi driver, who was a gentleman who was from the Punjab, he was, weaving in and out of the traffic, and some of his language I would have to describe as swearing. He was using a lot of pretty rough language, but he seemed like a very pleasant fellow. So the judgment I made was, I don't think he realizes that that is not the kind of language that you should be using when there's a lady in your taxi. Now, I could have chosen to say something to him, but honestly, I did not want to embarrass him. So I just let it go. It's just a taxi ride. It doesn't really matter to me one way or the other. Now, if, you know, he was getting ready for a job interview or something like that, then I would want to assist him to say, by the way, this is not the language that you would want to use in that situation. And if people know that we mean well and we're trying to help them, then usually they will not be offended. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I will go back to the presentation. But I am finding these conversations very interesting, so I do thank you for your questions most sincerely.
Yes.
So I'm now going to be talking to you about genre. Now, I don't know whether this is a term that you're very familiar with, but it is an important concept in our English education courses. And you can see here an example of one of the textbooks, and that takes a genre approach. And you can see from the age of the little child on the textbook that this is an approach which goes from early childhood through up into adult education. So genres are kinds of texts. They're the ways that we create groupings or categories of text depending on their social purpose. Texts that fulfill the same social purpose share similar configurations of words and grammatical structures, or what we sometimes call text and language features. They share text and language features. So these patterns are what we call genres, or sometimes we use the term text type rather than genre. So I've been talking in the lecture so far about language, and we've really been looking more at that kind of like interactional level rather than at the level of a text. Now we're going to move to that text level. So the immediate social context in which a text is produced determines the language variety of the text. So just to return to the idea about language, we're now thinking about genre. And one of the genres, for instance, is narrative. The narrative genre, which is the structure of a story. And you can see there that the narrative it's overlapping into the written and the spoken language, because a lot of genres are not limited to just writing or just to speaking. We can choose whether we want to write the text or whether we want to speak it. Or sometimes we have other options as well, like we could perform it or act it out like a play in a theatre. Some of the other genres we have are argument. An argument is when our main purpose is to convince somebody, to persuade them of our thinking. And then another one is procedure. A procedure is when we want to explain to someone how to do something. The classic example of a procedure is a recipe. So we can get a cookbook, or we can go onto a cooking website, and we can see the steps that we need to take if we want to make something, make a certain kind of cake or a certain type of dish. So in Australian schools, children are taught about these different genres, and they are asked to be able to identify what type of genre a text is by looking at its language features and its structural features. And they are expected to be able to produce texts in these different genres. Sometimes they would be producing them with writing, sometimes in spoken form, and sometimes they would be producing them in multimodal form using, for instance, video or audio or different types of combinations. So now I'm going to read to you from a piece of spoken language. And these are words that were spoken by a little boy aged 6 years old. I'm calling him Wade. That's not his actual name, but in research, we can't share the actual names of people. And my question to you is, how can we tell that this is a narrative? How can we tell that this piece of spoken language, which I've written down, is a narrative? And you might actually be familiar with this story as well. Once upon a time, there was 3 little pigs that was named Thomas, Jefferson, and Jeff. And there were 2. One was building a straw house, and one was building a brick house, and one was building a metal house. There was a big bad wolf coming to wreck the houses, and they were running to all of their houses, and then the wolf got deaded because the metal, it was too strong. So we've got a child's language here. This is the words that that little boy had to say when he told that story. And Sari has said that one of the clues we have that this is in the narrative genre is this little boy starts with once upon a time, and Ida has noted that as well. So yes, indeed, that's one of the signs that tells us that little Wade understands what a narrative is and how to make one. And then 50 Nova says that it's a story because it has conflict. Very true. In a story, a narrative, something needs to happen. We often call this part of the narrative the complication. And then we expect that in the story, there's going to be some kind of a resolution. There will be a pathway through the complication, and something will happen that will bring us to the ending of the story. And particularly if it's a children's story, we normally expect that ending to be a happy one. Now, we can see also that Wade he's trying to remember a story, and he has innovated a bit on the story. I have never myself read a version of the 3 Little Pigs where there was a metal house, only in Wade's version of the 3 Little Pigs. And I like the fact that he's got a metal house because he's clearly thinking of what would be something very, very strong. And he's right, metal is very strong. We can also see that Wade is still learning his language, and he isn't using always grammatically correct expressions. We don't say the wolf got deaded. We would say the wolf got killed maybe, or the wolf died. But of course, Wade's only 6 years old, so he's kind of still in the transitional stage of learning about his language. But as you have already identified, he is giving us sufficient clues to show us that he understands about the structure of the narrative genre. So he has got an orientation. Once upon a time, there was 3 little pigs that was named Thomas, Jefferson, and Jeff. Now, again, I personally have never read a version of the 3 Little Pigs where they did have those names, but those were the ones that Wade came up with. Actually, it's interesting that in most versions of the 3 Little Pigs, they aren't given names at all. So Wade obviously felt like this would be an improvement on the story to have names for the characters. Then there was a complication. There was a big bad wolf coming to wreck their houses. And then finally, there's a resolution. The wolf got deaded because the metal, it was too strong. So we can see that Wade has succeeded in presenting us with a narrative. Now, narrative genre is pretty well understood, and it's very commonly taught in schools. And most children, before they even arrive at school, have got some kind of understanding of the story. Many of them have encountered stories, either their parents have read them stories, or they've been watching television and viewing book readings. But new genres are emerging all the time, and some of them are completely different from the ones that are on the school curriculum. One of those genres is the sports commentary. Now, I say the sports commentary is a genre because everybody knows what it sounds like. If you're a sports fan and you watch sports on TV and you have listened to the sports commentator, then you would know what a sports commentator sounds like. And if you were with a group of children who were enjoyed watching sport and you asked them to role play sports commentary, then many children can do that very effectively. In fact, the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation in England, actually ran a competition where they were searching for the Young Commentator of the Year. And this is from their website. So from the fact that the BBC has identified that there are enough children out there who are interested in sports that they can run a competition for the Young Commentator of the Year, suggests to me that sports commentary has got enough regularity in it, has got enough well-known conventions to it that we could call that a genre. So the question is, what are the text and language features of sports commentary? Now, I have talked about, I've named up this lecture as an inquiry approach, and that is the kind of inquiry question that I would pose to students. Because when we ask a question, then our students become investigators, and that motivates them to have a look or have a listen at examples of sports commentary and try to figure out what they have in common. Can you describe some of the features of this spoken genre? I can see some ideas coming up in the chat. So Ida has said progressive forms of tenses, self-expressions are some of the possible features of sports commentary as a genre. So in sports commentary, we need language for describing action. 50 Nova has said the commentator will start the speech by saying their names and where they're reporting from, and that's very true as well. That's one of the structural features of a sports broadcast. In terms of the language, commentators need to know their action words. These words are those that indicate processes. So they need to indicate the actions, what people are doing, the senses, what they are thinking and feeling, because sports commentators want us to get involved in what's happening. You know, not just to kind of think about a bunch of people just running around and kicking balls. We want to think of this as a human drama where people are making decisions all the time, where people are responding and having emotional reactions. Also, we need words to indicate processes, what people are saying, and also we need words to indicate relations, what they are being and what they are having. So that's a lot of linguistic knowledge that an effective sports commentator needs to have at their disposal. They also need to be using words to tell us about when process is happening, and we need to use tense to do that. So in sports commentary, there are processes that are happening at the moment that I am commentating. That is, I'm commentating on these actions as they are unfolding in that moment. But I'm also relating these actions to what has gone before. And I'm making predictions as to what will be the consequences of these actions in the immediate future and the longer term future. So I need a really good grasp of my tenses. So you'll be using present tense to describe action as it happens and past tense to refer to relevant information. Now, obviously, there are heaps more tenses than that. We can get very, very technical with tenses, and depending on how advanced your students are in their English, you can get to any level of technicality. So we've also got a few more comments here in the chat. Commentators have to focus on what's going on at the moment. That's very true. And one of the things that's quite challenging for a commentator is when not very much is going on. So cricket is one of those sports, particularly long form cricket, test cricket, that sometimes, you know, there's not a lot happening, and there used to be a joke being made about the way that the commentators would talk about the seagulls, which are birds that you often find on Australian cricket pitches. They need to understand the sports register, very true, and they need the vocabulary. Now, one of the things that if educators aren't interested in sport, and not all teachers actually enjoy sport and find it very interesting, they quite often don't understand the variety and range of language that's used in sports commentary and how advanced that sometimes is as well. So one of the things that we think about in terms of having an English curriculum where students have got, you know, they're engaged, they're motivated, you know, they're provided with a social context for their language learning, is trying to connect with the things that interest them. And sports is something that interests quite a few of our students. Certainly in Australia, I mean, Australians are known to be pretty much crazy about sport. And I'm not too sure how big sport is in Indonesia, but I'm sure that there are a lot of sports fans in your country. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. I got a little tickle in my throat. Okay. So I'm moving on to an inquiry approach, but before I do that, I would like to once again pause. So I've been talking about genre, and I've just very, very quickly highlighted a few genres and I guess the general idea about genre. I'm wondering if this has raised any questions. Or we could go back to some of the things we were talking about before. That would be fine also. Would you like me to just keep going? Because I'm happy to do that. Oh, Fatia has got her hand up. Was that Fatia? Oh, yes. Edith says keep going, but we'll see what Fatia has to say.
Okay. Okay, so when we have a reading, so my question is, how could we help students to identify the language featured of a certain text, because of it might be too complicated to understand those terms?
Good question. The thing about genres is they come in many different levels of complexity. So if we think about narrative, for instance, you know, that little boy told a very simple story. It's not very complex, but I can read a novel which is full of complexity. It has lots and lots of characters. It has plots and subplots. It has, you know, descriptive passages and so on. It has got extended vocabulary. One of the things that I think works pretty well is when we're looking at genre, we actually provide examples at a range of different levels of complexity. So with the most simple ones, our students will be able to see the main structural features. And then for those students who would like to go further, who want to understand that more advanced level, we can provide those examples as well. And that way, each student should be able to see being demonstrated in these different texts, the main features. They'll be able to make connections across those texts. Does that make sense?
All right, thank you, Dr. Nicole. So it means that by giving first some example like that.
Yes, I would say multiple examples. Because if we're asking our students, what are the text and language features? So sometimes we tell them, all right, that's fine. Sometimes I just say, it's the narrative, these are the features. But if it's something like sports commentary, I might say, let's have a look at an example and also think about the sports commentary that you have listened to. And now let's see if we can identify the features. You know, you can do like a brainstorm. You know what a brainstorm is, right? Just write everything you can think of down. Like get into your groups and think of kind of like, what are the features of a sports commentary? And then bring it all together and see what comes out of that.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. So I'll just check the chat. Yes, so people still thinking about the sports commentary and the tones that are used. I mean, I think it would be really fun to have a look at some examples. You know, that might be something you like to do later on. Some of the children who have participated in that competition about sports commentators, there are some of their recordings of them commentating are actually online, so you can go have a look at those later on if you want to. Okay, moving on. So I promised to be talking about an inquiry approach. Actually, I've been using an inquiry approach throughout the lecture because I've been asking you questions, and that's partly to stimulate you to think in an inquiring way. But now, just to be really focused about that, what does an inquiry approach mean? It means to involve learners in investigating language. Sometimes we say you're going to become language detectives or language researchers. You are going to be the ones that are going to be seeking and finding out things about language. This means encouraging learners to listen and observe when they are in different contexts, so they can make their own observations and their comparisons. For instance, in a context where people are being very polite and formal compared to a context where people are being very relaxed and informal. Noticing when people change their language, e.g. when talking about different topics or when addressing different audiences, we can start noticing when that happens. And an inquiry approach can mean using how and why questions to focus on the functions of language. How is language being used in this situation? And why might it be being used that way? Why do we think this language is being used in this situation? So you see, that's really different from a kind of what. What is the language? A lot of teaching in language is really answering that question. But an inquiry approach is really more about how the language is being used and why that might be happening. And for instance, we've been doing that, right? So I showed you that cartoon with Jeremy and his mum, and we talked about what's going on in this situation. Why are they communicating like that to each other? And that led us to an insight that perhaps they have different purposes in this communication. So rather than just telling people have different purposes, we can observe what's happening. In that case, it doesn't have to be like following people around in the street and listening to their language. We can use cartoons and we can use, you know, little snippets out of the TV shows and things like that. And we can use that as a basis for our inquiry approach. So the other thing about an inquiry approach is we're not so much noticing about whether the language is correct or incorrect. Now, of course, as educators, there are times when we want to teach children the rules or learners the conventions so that they can make the choices that are appropriate. So, of course, it is necessary to use language correctly in that sense. But when we are taking an inquiry approach, we don't want to just push away language that doesn't appear to be correct. Instead, we would ask about the function of the language. why is that language being used? Now, in the case of little Wade and his story about the three pigs, some of his language is not correct in a sense because he's still learning how to use language. And he's also put things in there like a metal house and the names of the pigs because he likes those details and he thinks that they make his story more interesting. So here are some of the teachers that I work with. And these teachers are all currently involved in conducting research with me. And they are conducting research about children's oral language. And their motivation in doing this is that they want to help their children to become more competent users of oral language. And the lady at the back there who's just popping her head in the door is Dr. Jenny Carter, who is my colleague on this project. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the work that these teachers have been doing. But first of all, I'd like to read this quote to you from Saylors and Hoffman. That's Misty Saylors, and I forget who her colleague is, Hoffman, which they wrote very recently about teachers doing research. They say, why must teachers engage in research? Research is a moral obligation for all professionals. We bear a responsibility to learn individually and collectively. We also have a social and moral obligation to our young people to serve them in the best ways we can reimagine. That's what transformative practice-based research is all about. And I think that is a good description of what's happening with these teachers. These teachers are motivated to try to be the best educators they can be. And that means that they want to know how they can support their children to be effective oral language users. And it's true, as Rita has said, that teacher research is similar to classroom action research. And in fact, I will be sharing that action research model with you, which it sounds like will be very familiar to you. So they came with their concerns about what they're noticing with their children, things that like children don't seem to be so keen to have conversations with their teachers and with their peers. And their oral vocabulary seems to be more limited. And some of these teachers have been working in classrooms for quite a few years now, so they were concerned with some changes they had seen occurring. So let's keep going. And here, indeed, is the action research, which some of you may be very familiar with. And we can see that it is a cyclical thing. Beginning with a research idea, now this might be a concern, something that is the teacher is wondering about, something they are observing, and they want to try to intervene and create an improvement. So the cycle of observing what is happening, reflecting, how do I understand what I'm seeing here, and acting. What do I think I want to do about this? What type of pedagogical intervention do I want to implement? So these teachers make a change in their practice. They implement something into their classroom, and each of these teachers had different ideas about what they wanted to implement. And all of them were looking at ideas which they hoped would facilitate children's participation in oral language interactions and the development of more fluency, a wider vocabulary, and so on. Now, these teachers have undergone their first cycle of classroom action research, and then they are in their second cycle now. So having undertaken their interventions, and they stop and they look at what they can find in terms of evidence for effectiveness. They then refine the interventions. So what worked really well? Okay, I will keep that in the plan. What did not work as well as I was hoping? Why did that not work so well? Is it something to do with my pedagogy? Is it something to do with my resources? Is it something to do with the children's learning needs? Then they can refine their plan and undertake another cycle. And that's where these teachers are at the moment. They're in that second cycle of action research. So when teachers undertake classroom action research or other forms of inquiry, then there are various tools and resources they can use. Now, because these educators are interested in children's oral language, they are using particular tools and resources that can help them to gather evidence about the children's oral language. One of the tools that I will be sharing with you is called the Teacher Rating of Oral Language and Literacy, or TROL for short. It's an acronym, and this is suitable for use with younger children, but it could possibly be adapted for older children. And also, children's talk can be audio recorded and can be assessed and analysed in a number of ways, and we will have a look at some of those ways in the next few slides. So this is not the whole of the TROL. It's actually got a lot more to it, but I will just show you some of it. And it's fairly easy to find if you want to get it online. So the thing about the TROL is it's really asking the teacher to observe what children are doing in their oral language interactions. So in order for the teacher to be able to fill this in, they are going to need to spend some time in observation. And it is done on an individual basis for particular children. Teachers may do this for every child in their class, or they might do it for selected children that they are particularly concerned about. So the question here is about language use, and you can see that there are 4 options there that the teacher can use to describe how the child typically engages in conversations. The first option, child almost never begins a conversation with peers or the teacher and never keeps trying if unsuccessful at first. And then we have other along the continuum until the 4th option is child begins conversations with both peers and teachers. If initial efforts fail, he or she will work hard to be understood. So the TROL is underpinned by some theories about what is effective competence in oral language. And you can see here that it's not just about the child's vocabulary, the number of words that they know, but it's also about the child's orientation to the communication situation. And there are 2 aspects here is, does the child initiate? Do they start a conversation? And the second one is, what does the child do if they are not being understood? Do they continue to try to communicate? So here's another part of the TROL, and this one asks the teacher to describe this child's pattern of asking questions about topics that interest him or her, e.g. why things happen, why people act the way they do. And so in order for the teacher to be able to answer this question, obviously they need to create opportunities in their classroom for children to ask questions about topics that interest them. So it implies that the classroom has got to be a particular type of communication environment where the teacher is open to having discussions in the class about things that are of interest to the children. Then some other questions in the TROL. We've got one here about the vocabulary of the child. So the teacher is asked to scale the child from never to often as to whether they use a varied vocabulary or try out new words. And then the next one, which is how understandable is the child? So this is really about how the child enunciates their language. And so that again is on a scale. Now the troll has been implemented with teachers, and it has also the outcomes of the teachers' evaluations have then been compared with the outcomes of independent researcher assessments of the same children. And you might be surprised to hear that the troll, the evaluations from the troll actually line up pretty well. They align with the evaluations of the independent assessors. You might be thinking that the troll seems like a pretty informal and not very scientific type of instrument. But the reason that it's like that is so that teachers can implement it as part of their professional practice. We're not asking teachers to be scientists or independent researchers. What we're trying to do is give them some tools so that they can begin to gather some information about their children as users of oral language, and then they can use that information to begin to plan activities which will assist children to build their strengths. So an approach that I've used to gathering oral language from children and with these teachers to engage them in analysing the children's language is an approach that we call invitation to talk. And the purpose of invitation to talk is to identify existing oral language capabilities, and we've got a number of schools that are involved in this project, and to establish a baseline prior to an intervention. So this is the teachers undertook this invitation to talk assessment before they undertook their interventions. The procedure is an individual one, so that each child is given some one-on-one time with an adult, which can be a teacher or a researcher. It usually takes about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the child. We ask the children if it's okay for us to record their talk. And nearly every time children will say that it is, but sometimes they don't want that to happen, in which case we will comply with their wishes. And then once we've got that all set up, we invite the children to do one of two things. Either they can tell a story or they can talk about something they know about. The reason we provide these two options is that we know that not every child really enjoys narrative, and not every child has been given exposure to narratives. But every child has something they know about, whatever that happens to be. And so that means that even if a child doesn't wish to tell a story or doesn't know any stories that they can tell, they will still be able to talk. The other thing that's really important if using the invitation to talk approach is that the adult, which is the teacher or the researcher, does not help the child, doesn't give the child words, because this is not a teaching activity, it is an inquiry activity. And if we are providing the child with lots of assistance, then we're not finding out what the child can do or can't do. And this is hard for educators sometimes because they don't like to see children kind of struggling to find a word. But it's also a good thing, because often if we're patient and give children time, they can show us what they're able to do, and they can surprise us as well. So here's an example of a transcript, and what a transcript is it is a written down record of something that has been audio recorded. So one of the kind of time consuming parts of all this is that the teachers also type out what the children have said. And I've chosen one that's really, really simple. Some children had much, much more to say than this. Some children told very long stories. So here we have the researcher saying, I've been asking the children to either tell me a story or tell me about something. What would you like to do? The child goes, story. The researcher says, tell me a story. I'd love to hear a story from you. The child says, when my dog dies, I get sad and I'm about to cry too. And the researcher waits and then says, and that's the end? Yeah. So that's what this child wanted to say. It's one statement. When my dog dies, I get sad and I'm about to cry too. So that was the invitation to talk, and that's the talk that the child provided in that instance. So now I'm going to talk to you about how the teachers have analysed the children's talk. This is not because you may want to go off and analyse, but it just helps to give you an insight into the types of inquiry activities that these teachers have been involved in. So first of all, they've got the transcript, which is they've typed it up. They copy that into a new file. And then we go through a process where what we are trying to do is to be able to count certain things. So first of all, we need to take out all the words the grown-ups said, and also all the ums and ahs. But sometimes children say words that it's hard to understand what they are, and sometimes they just make up words. We keep those ones in. And what we wind up with is a total of all the words the child said. We count that and we write that down. Now we've got another step. Here we want to take out all the repeated words and all the inaudible words. When we talk, we repeat words all the time. But what we want to find out is how many words the child knows. So we want to get it down to that list of words. Then we count those, and what we get is the total lexical items, the total of the distinct, separate words the child knows. And then finally, we look at what kind of words they are. Now, I don't have time in this lecture to talk to you about these particular categories of words, which I've mentioned here, but just briefly, we think about words as being in 3 categories. One is our everyday words. 2 is our what we call literary words, or you might think of them as story words. And 3 are our specialist words. They're words that we learn in subjects like science, technology, and so on. Those are the 3 kind of words. How are you going, folks? I hope you're not feeling too hungry. You got a nice iftar to go to tonight? Yay, bet you're looking forward to that. All right, so having done that analysis, we now have got a form where we can fill out the topic the child talked about, which is, this one was my dog, and then the figures of length in words, total number of words, and then the types of words used. Here's another example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop after this. I want you to be thinking about what is this genre that you think the child is speaking in, and what are some of the things that you notice about this child's talk. So this talk was gathered in the context of science. One of the teachers in the group was trying to get children to use more scientific language in their writing. And so what she decided to do is to have an approach called talking drawing. In this approach, the child did a drawing first, and then they talked about their drawing. And she recorded the child talking about the drawing. And this is what this child had to say. Hi guys, today I will be telling you about the aerofoil shape. It's the shape of an aeroplane's wings. It helps it go through the sky easy. There are 4 forces that help it go easier. One is drag, one is thrust, one is air, and one is gravity. Aerofoil shape is very, well, it's like this curve, like curve and not curved. A bit of it's curved and a bit of it's flat. That's all I'll be telling you for now. Bye. All right. Have a little look about that piece of talk from the child. And then I want you to think about, what do you notice about this child's talk? This was a science teacher who was gathering this talk. What do you think she would think about it? Not seeing anything coming up on the chat. It's an explanation. Yes, it is. It is an explanation. And that is a kind of genre. What about the language that this child is using in their explanation? If you had to categorize those words in the 3 groups, which is the everyday words, the literary words or story words, and the specialist words, which are like the science words, what would you notice about the child's vocabulary in that piece of talk? His language is more developed. He's using a specific term, technical terms indeed. Now, this particular child was one of the children this teacher had been concerned about. This child really wasn't using a lot of language in the science lesson. Their writing was very limited. But when this teacher implemented the talking drawing approach as part of her inquiry, this child was able to use their scientific language and create an explanation. By doing the drawing first, that seemed to assist the child to pull on their knowledge and their vocabulary. So that way the teacher was able to see that the child had actually understood the content and they understood the language and they could use that vocabulary. So that teacher was actually very pleased with the intervention. She felt that this was a successful intervention because she was able to see that the children in her class were having more to say, so they were speaking for longer, but also the language that they were using was the appropriate scientific language. So as a result, this teacher is going to continue to implement the talking drawing approach. Just before I go on, because I think I only have got about 10 minutes and I've got a few more slides. Are there any other questions that have come into your minds? No? All right, I'll continue with, I'm nearly at the end, folks. So it will soon be dinner time. All right, let's keep going. So this is just the summary of the piece of talk that we just had a look at there. So that child used 83 words and there were 52 lexical items, which is quite a good high level of lexical density, as we say. In terms of the type of language, a lot of it was tier 3 or the specialist language. 13 of those words were scientific words. Now, some of these words were not particularly difficult words, but the teacher categorized them as scientific words in that particular curriculum context because she had been teaching a unit on flight. Now, we were talking before about misunderstandings, I think, and I mentioned that I would be showing an example where there was a misunderstanding between a child and an adult in the course of this research project. So this particular bit of talk I'm going to share with you was one that came out of the Invitation to Talk project. Children have their own interests and those might be different from yours. So to understand how children use their language, it can be helpful to learn about their interests. So in this example, which I'm about to show you, the researcher had to learn about Minecraft, which is a very popular digital game Do kids in Indonesia like playing Minecraft? Certainly in Australia, it's very popular. And this child was talking about Minecraft, which the researcher was not familiar with. I'm just having a look in the chat. Yes, it is a game. So here is a bit of the child's talk. Now, if you don't understand what this child is meaning, then there's a reason for that. It would be because you don't play Minecraft. And the child was very engaged in the talk. Entity 303, begin, destroy everything in the house. I also ought to mention that this child has English as an additional language, and their family has not been in Australia for very long. So you will notice quite a few language features that are not regular. Entity 303, begin, destroy everything in the house. Begin the game, then once he finds you, then kills you, everything in your house will start turning on and start flashing, everything flash. And then when that's finished, all of it breaks. You can't use it again. You have to buy another one. The researcher goes, oh my goodness. And the child goes, yeah, there's even Herobrine. And the researcher goes, Herobrine? And the child said, Herobrine. He's the enemy of Entity 303. Now, the researcher in this case was one of my students called Therese Lovett, and she's now doing her doctorate on children's language development in the context of Minecraft. She became so fascinated with this example that she actually signed up and registered herself with Minecraft, and she got an account and she started playing the game. And it was only after she did that that she actually started to understand what this child was talking about. You can see in the interaction, the child is using the term Herobrine, which is a name of a character in the game, and that's how it's meant to be spelt. But the researcher wasn't familiar with the game at all. So what she heard was Herobrine. Brian is an English language name, and hero, of course, means, you know, a heroic figure. So the child then gets frustrated because that adult did not understand. They haven't said the name correctly. So the child corrects the adult. Herobrine. Then he explains who this Herobrine is. He's the enemy of Entity 303. Just check the chat again. Sari has said that children might have advanced vocabularies related to their interests while they might not necessarily be advanced language learners. Absolutely. This particular child, when it came to talking about Minecraft, he was able to draw on his understanding of that game and use language that reflected that. So what happened with the researcher is that she went into Minecraft, the Minecraft world, and then she began to understand what the child was talking about. For instance, this child says, Entity 303, begin, destroy everything in the house. And you can see here a screenshot from the game, and that is exactly what happens when Entity 303 turns up in the game, a very destructive impact. And then the child said that when Entity 303 comes into the game, everything flash. And you can see there that flash that's happening on screen. And then we see Herobrine, the enemy of Entity 303. So then you can see the two characters, Herobrine on the left and Entity 303 on the right, and the VS in the middle saying versus, which is indicating that they are opponents. So in this case, we have a child who English is not his first language, and he has got a very strong interest in this game, and he is highly motivated to communicate about it. And because the researcher really wants to understand his world, she informs herself about the game, and then she has got a much better understanding of what that child is talking about. So what have we learned from the Invitation to Talk study? And this is what have we learned as the researchers who've been undertaking this study. Here are some of the things that have come out of it. Nearly all the children responded positively to the invitation to talk. Most of them preferred to tell stories, so the narrative genre was preferred, and particularly the girls preferred that one. Some of the children's spoken texts were complex. They were long, they had a lot of different elements, multiple characters, sometimes more than one storyline, and sometimes an advanced vocabulary. All these children were 6 years old, by the way. And children for whom English was an additional language were equally able to produce oral compositions as their peers and to perform these effectively. We also saw that popular culture, media, and play were important contexts for children, providing content for their communications and also their language. So I'm now up to my conclusion, and I would like to leave you with a few questions and challenges for you to think about as you move forward in your development as educators. How can you integrate a functional approach into your language learning or teaching? What how questions and why questions can you ask your learners about language use? What language genres could you investigate? How could you find out about learners' context in order to better understand their meanings? So that's where I want to leave it for this evening. And I want to thank you most sincerely for giving me this opportunity to talk with you and for sharing with me some of your questions and comments. And I think we have just a few minutes really for any further discussion. Yes, thank you, Rita. I'm hoping to be in a position to write about it. We have written one paper from the study, and I've also got an online presentation. So Elena can ask me for those details in case any of you would like to learn a little bit more about it. Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions or comments. Does anyone have any closing remarks that they'd like to make? Oh, Saida Saya has raised their hand. Saida?
Yes.
Hello. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Okay. Hello, Dr. Nichols. My name is Saida Saya. I was interested when talking about the technique of using language, and so how we as a student use the language when we are facing many genres in reading. Are there any tips or trick to be such a native speaker and in understanding and explaining the story? That is my question. Thank you.
That's a very good question, and I like that you are asking how questions. As you know, I'm very keen on how questions, and I like that you asking me about the genres. There is some really useful resources about genre-based teaching of English, and I don't have time to share those with you this evening, but if you go searching online for genre-based English teaching, as genre-based English teaching, you will find some of these resources. You can also look for resources about specific genres. So for instance, the narrative genre, the procedure genre, and so on. You can look for, you know, there's books, worksheets, activities, all kinds of stuff that you can find online. Good luck with that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Nichols, I think this is such an interesting sharing from you, and you've got quite a lot of feedback, and there are a lot of interesting questions from the audiences. It means that they are very interested in your in the topic that you share with us today. So if I can conclude, maybe we as a language teacher and a future language teacher, we need to keep in our mind that language is actually a means of communication in which each individuals use language to interact with others. And of course, the strategy we use to facilitate our students' language learning need to be based on how students actually experiencing the context of the language, and the context must be something interesting and appropriate for them. Am I right?
That's a great summary. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, yes, Dr. Nichols.
I would just like to say that it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to speak with future educators. It's something that I really treasure, and that I hope one day that I can come and meet with you in person.
We are waiting for that, for sure. Okay, so I think due to the time limit, I think we have to stop. Thank you so much for this wonderful academic insights from you, Dr. Nichols, and thank you so much for all the participants or the audience's attention so far. And I return this floor to Ibu Erlina. Okay, thank you, Dr. Nichols, thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Linga. Well, once again, thank you very much, Dr. Su Nichols, for these great sessions. I believe that the students learned a lot of things from this today's presentation and discussion. The students asked a lot of questions. I think hopefully that this will make them more interesting in teaching and learning the language. And one thing for sure, this will be a challenging for us to see the implementation of an inquiry approach to see the students' development for EFL teaching and learning, because this might be a good area of research as well, to see how the students develop their language in terms of when they learn English as a foreign language. So hopefully we could have more opportunities to work with you in the future, and love to have you come and visit us in Indonesia someday.
Definitely.
Hopefully this pandemic will end soon. Yeah.
All right.
So by the way, I miss Adelaide so much.
We miss you too. And I hope to welcome you back again, and anybody else who would like to visit when the world gets back to normal, and we hope that will be soon.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Su Nichols, and thank you again, and see you in the next event.
Bye everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for participating today.
Thank you.